Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. The tires of the RV, a rusted 1980s beast, Alara had christened the drift, groaned one last time against the gravel, the sound swallowed instantly by the relentless wind. She cut the engine. The resulting silence was less a cessation of noise and more a profound shift in the world. As acoustic balance, the wind and the sea, previously background, surged forward, sounding like 1,000 distant ghosts sighing into the rock face. Alara didn't move from the driver seat. She stared through the cracked windshield. The odometer had clocked exactly 1876 miles since she left the Midwest, each one promising this specific, terrifying liberation. Before her lay the Pacific Ocean, or at least the idea of it. The sky was the color of old pewter, smeared with thick, fast, moving clouds that seemed to be actively trying to escape the earth. Below the cliff, the water was a churning slate, gray mass, slamming itself against the base of the precipice with a sound that felt more physical than audible, a deep, rhythmic thud, thud, thud that vibrated up through the RV's chassis and into her bones. And then there was the parking spot. She was not merely near the cliff. She was parked in a spot that felt less like land and more like a stubborn, final protrusion of rock daring the abyss to swallow it. The nearest tire was perhaps 4 feet from a sheer 100-foot drop. The spot was a remnant of an old abandoned lighthouse service road, barely wider than the drift itself, and it offered no guardrail, no warning sign, only a few bleached fragments of wood that might have once been a fence. Perfect, Alara muttered, the word thin and brittle against the roar outside. She reached for the lever that tilted the seat back, finally allowing her body to sink into the worn vinyl. She chosen this place because it was impossible to ignore. Her life had become a series of easy denials, unopened bills, unreturned calls, unshed tears, all shielded by the comfortable white noise of modern existence. Here, there was only one truth: the cliff. You could ignore the bank, you could ignore the past, but you could not ignore the raw geologic edge of the continent threatening to slide you into the sea. This was a place where things were felt, not excused. After a long moment, she forced herself to action. The RV shuddered as she moved, a sickening, gentle rock that made her stomach clench. It was just the wind, she told herself. But the wind wasn't a constant push. It came in aggressive, heavy shoulders, like something large leaning against the wall. Testing its patience, she found her worn duffel bag and pulled out the necessities: a cheap flashlight, a box of waterproof matches, and a half-full bottle of warm flat soda. There was no cell service. That was non-negotiable. She hadn't spoken to a soul in 5 days, and she wasn't about to start now. The small galley kitchen was crammed into the center of the cabin. She tried the gas range, twisting the knob. Nothing. The tank must be empty. Figure it out later. The sun, though hidden, was beginning its sluggish descent, and the light inside the cabin was taking on that sickly yellow, gray hue that precedes a storm. She went to the back, to the built-in bed nook, framed by 3 small, dusty windows. The rear window, facing the drop, provided the most unnerving view. It was so close, so immediate. She could almost feel the cold spray of the sea mist on the glass. It was while she was checking the windows, running a finger along the brittle, graying seals, that she noticed the irregularity. It wasn't on the window, or the frame, or the wall. It was on the floor, a discoloration in the cheap linoleum tile beneath the bed. It was a dark, oily stain, nearly the color of dried blood, and it had been poorly scrubbed at some point. She knelt, pressing her nose close. It didn't smell metallic or savory. It smelled faintly of salt and something acrid, like cheap bleach trying and failing to mask something organic. Old rust, she rationalized. The RV was ancient. Leaks were inevitable. She stood up quickly, feeling the familiar, irrational jump of her heart. She was being ridiculous. She was alone, isolated, and highly stressed. Every shadow was a figure. Every groan of the wood was a footstep. She went back to the front, finding the heavy metal latch for the side door. She had to get outside, just to secure the stabilizing jacks before dark. The door required a solid heave, sticking on its swollen frame. When it finally popped open, the wind tore through the cabin, howling like a creature finally released from a trap, whipping her hair across her face. Alara stepped onto the precarious strip of land. The air here was alive, a violent cocktail of salt, decay, and pine needles from the few stunted trees clinging further back from the drop. She walked around to the passenger side, her boots crunching on the loose shale. As she leaned down to locate the crank handle for the front jack, her gaze fell to the ground just beneath the RV's undercarriage. A stone. It was a smooth beach, tumbled piece of black basalt, perfectly round and about the size of a plum. Nothing remarkable, except that it was sitting atop a patch of loose, freshly disturbed dirt. Then she saw the indentation. It wasn't a footprint, but a depression in the gravel, deep and clean, as if something heavy and perfectly spherical had rested there for a long time. The basalt stone was sitting exactly in the center of the depression, slightly damp, as if recently touched. Alara stared at it, her mind stalling. She hadn't noticed this before, and there was no other disturbed earth nearby. As she reached down to pick up the stone, the wind gusted again, a deafening blast that made the drift list perceptibly toward the edge. She froze, fingers hovering just above the damp black rock. It wasn't the RV moving that stopped her. It was the realization that the heavy, round stone she was about to touch felt inexplicably warm, despite the chilling temperature of the air and the ground. And then, a sound. Not the wind, not the waves. A tap. It came from inside the RV directly behind her. It was a small, sharp click, like a door being deliberately and softly locked. Alara's breath hitched, sucking the cold air into her lungs. Every muscle seized. She was standing 4 feet from a 100-foot drop, and something, or someone, was inside the drift with the door now shut. The click was small, sharp, and final, the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal latch sliding into place. It was a noise of intent, not accident. Alara's mind, which had spent days operating in a haze of self-pity and exhaustion, snapped violently into the present. Her muscles remained locked, half, crouched over the warm basalt stone, her breath snagged in her throat. She could feel the wind pressing relentlessly against her back, pushing her the few short feet, separating her from the 100-foot fall. The sheer impossibility of the situation was the only thing preventing a full-blown scream. No one is here. There are no other cars. There is no other human being within miles. She pivoted, a slow, grinding rotation that felt agonizingly audible against the crunch of the gravel. Her gaze darted to the main RV door. It was closed, perfectly flush with the frame. The heavy metal handle, which she had just wrenched open, was now resting in the locked position. She lunged forward, grasping the cold steel. She twisted the handle, yanking upward and then slamming her shoulder against the swollen door frame. It didn't budge. The mechanism inside had truly sealed. She tried again, panic lending her a frantic, useless strength. The door was a solid, unyielding barrier, a sound inside the RV. Not the previous clean click, but a drawn-out, scraping noise, like metal being dragged slowly across the linoleum floor. It seemed to come from the galley, right in the center of the cabin. Ilara backed away from the door, careful not to take her eyes off it. Her heart was a frenetic drum in her ribs, urging her to run. But running where? The nearest town was an hour away, and the fading light would make the treacherous service road impossible to navigate on foot. Behind her was the drop. To her left, the dense, ancient cypress forest that hugged the edge of the plateau. She forced herself to move, skirting the passenger side of the drift. She had to stay low, out of the worst of the wind. As assault, her hands braced against the RV's rusty metal flank. She passed the first window. It was small, dusty, and high. She wiped a patch of grime with her sleeve and peered in. The front half of the cabin, the driver seat, the bench, the table, was submerged in shadow. She saw nothing, but the scraping noise had ceased. A silence had returned, but this one was heavy and expectant, worse than the frantic noise. She moved to the central window by the galley. Again, she wiped the glass. For a terrifying, endless second, she saw a movement. It wasn't a shadow cast by the wind, but an actual, solid displacement of air. It was a shape too tall to be an animal, too fast to be a person, that flickered past the window in the time it took her to blink. It was low to the floor, yet elongated. It felt less like a body and more like a dense streak of black smoke given momentary form. Alara gasped, stumbling backward. Her heel caught on something, and she nearly pitched over, the immediate threat of the cliff edge momentarily eclipsing the horror inside the vehicle. She caught herself on the RV's side, knuckles white against the cold metal. As she recovered, she looked down. She had tripped over the black basalt stone. It lay there, pulsing slightly with an inner, unnatural heat, steaming lightly as the cool night air condensed the moisture clinging to its surface. The stone. The one that was in the impression, the one that was warm. She snatched it up. It was hot, almost painfully so, but the pain was a grounding presence. It was real, tangible, and suddenly it felt less like a curiosity and more like a tool. The only way in was the driver's side door. It was a temperamental, rusty monstrosity that hadn't properly opened or closed in years without a forceful, two-handed wrestling match. She ran to the front of the vehicle, planting her feet on the precarious shale. "Open up," she whispered, her voice husky with terror. She grabbed the rusted handle and pulled with everything she had. The door resisted. It was stiff, protesting years of sea air and neglect. She leaned back, bracing her spine, pulling until her muscles burned. The door frame was groaning, a different groan than the wind, a metallic, tortured complaint. Crack, with a violent, shuddering wrench, the driver's door tore open, scraping against the RV's body and revealing a dark maw of an interior. She tumbled in, landing awkwardly in the footwell, dropping the basalt stone onto the vinyl floor. She didn't wait. Scrambling upright, she slammed the door shut behind her, twisting the interior lock mechanism with a shaking hand. It was an impotent gesture, but the thunk of the lock settling home provided a small, desperate feeling of security. She was inside, and whatever had sealed the main door was still here. She grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat where she left it. Its beam, thin and weak, sliced across the small cabin. Everything looked exactly as it had minutes ago, yet profoundly wrong. The worn olive-green bench was pristine. The cheap wood paneling felt solid. The counter was clear. but the light was wrong. The sickly, pre-dusk gloom had deepened into an unnerving blackness that swallowed the corners of the room. The wind noise, previously overwhelming, was now muffled by the RV's walls, allowing her to hear the smaller, more sinister sounds of the enclosed space. The scraping noise started again. Scrape, scrape. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, coming from the galley area behind the counter. Alara held the flashlight steady, illuminating the kitchen. On the floor, directly beneath the sink, lay the only can of soup she had packed. It was rolling, but not continuously. It was rolling back and forth, moving only a few inches at a time, exactly matching the rhythm of the scrape sound. It was being pushed. She crept forward, skirting the rolling can of soup, her gaze sweeping toward the bed nook at the back. The sheer blue floral curtain that separated the living space from the bedroom was no longer fully open as she had left it. It was now hanging halfway across the doorway, perfectly still despite the subtle rocking of the RV. The fabric looked strangely opaque, like a dense sheet of water, reflecting no light. She raised the flashlight, pointing the beam directly at the gap in the curtain. "Who is there?" she tried to ask, but the sound that came out was a high, thin croak. No answer, only the rhythmic, gentle scrape of the soup can being nudged beneath the counter. She edged closer, the warm basalt stone now forgotten in the driver. As footwell, the smell here was stronger, salt and brine, with that underlying metallic tang. It was the scent of a tide pool that had been left to rot under the sun, mingled with old copper. With a sudden, desperate movement, she slapped the flashlight beam against the wall and ripped the curtain aside. The bed nook was empty. The narrow bed, the dusty window, the flimsy wood paneling, all were just as she had left them, except for the floor. She remembered the dark, oily stain she had seen earlier, the one she had dismissed as old rust. It was no longer a dry set. In stain, the entire area around it was glistening, wet with a foul, smelling liquid, and the liquid wasn't tea pooling in the lowest dip of the floor. It was spreading outward from the center of the stain, creeping uphill toward the walls of the RV, defying gravity with a slow, purposeful expansion. Alara fell to her knees, choking back a cry of revulsion. She shone the flashlight down. The liquid was thick, black, and slick, reflecting the beam like crude oil, and at the epicenter of the spreading pool, where the original stain had been, a section of the linoleum tile was gone. Not torn up, it was as if the circular section, roughly the size of a dinner plate, had simply dissolved. Beneath it, the cheap plywood subfloor was also gone, revealing an opening to the darkness below. It was a perfectly clean, circular hole, and its edges were unnaturally smooth, not splintered like a saw cut, but polished, as if they had been eroded by relentless water over millennia. The scraping noise was loud now. It was no longer the can of soup. The can had stopped moving. The scraping was coming from inside the hole. It was a wet, heavy sound, like something struggling to pull itself through a tight space. Alara brought her face closer, the brine and copper scent overwhelming her. She could feel a blast of icy, cold air rising from the darkness below, an air that seemed utterly alien to the stale, warm air of the cabin. She tilted the flashlight, peering into the hole. It was black, absolute black, swallowing the beam entirely. There was no visible bottom, only the sense of immense hollow space. As she stared, transfixed, a small black object shot out of the hole, propelled upward by an unseen force. It struck the ceiling of the bed nook with a soft thwack, bounced once on the mattress, and landed on the floor near her knee. It was the basalt stone, the warm, rounded stone she had left in the driver's footwell, but now it was cold, slimy, and covered in a dense, black, viscous sludge, the same liquid spreading across the floor. Alara's breath caught. She didn't he have time to process the impossible travel of the stone. From the hole, the scraping intensified. It became a guttural, wet heave. Then, something black and thick emerged. It wasn't a limb, or a tentacle, or even a piece of wood. It was an organic, slick cable of absolute blackness, gleaming with the caustic brine, and it moved with a terrifying, deliberate speed. It lashed out, not toward her face, but toward her left wrist. The cable wrapped around her arm, instantly cold and burning at the same time, the grip firm and crushing. Before she could scream, before she could even fall back, the thing began to retract, pulling her, violently and surely, toward the polished, black, rimmed hole in the floor of the drift. The black cable was not merely wrapped around her wrist, it was fused to it, a suction of crushing cold that burned worse than any heat. Alara's scream was choked off, reduced to a desperate, ragged sound as she was hauled forward. The plywood floor, slick with the viscous, black ooze, offered no purchase. Her boots scraped uselessly against the spreading slime as the cable tightened its grip, pulling her face. First toward the perfectly circular maw in the floor. It smelled like a million drowned things, stirred into concentrated salt and old pennies. The smell was suffocating, thick enough to taste, and it fueled a primal surge of adrenaline. This wasn't some slow, atmospheric dread. This was brutal, immediate violence, and it shocked her system into raw survival mode. She had maybe 3 seconds before the hole swallowed her. Her right hand, free of the cable, clawed frantically at the floor, catching on the ridge of the missing linoleum tile. The effort only earned her a spray of the freezing, caustic liquid that splashed across her cheek. The substance stung immediately, and she blinked rapidly, momentarily blinded by the pain. The whirl tilted, the RV shuddered under a massive gust of wind, and the shift in weight, Alara's body being dragged down, combined with the wind's pressure, made the entire structure groan violently. The circular hole was now inches from her face. She could hear the heaving from below, a thick, bubbling inhalation, followed by a slow, squelching exhale, like a colossal lung trying to clear itself of mud. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she jammed her elbow against the floor, buying half a second. Her flashlight, which she had dropped when the cable seized her, lay agonizingly close to the edge of the bednote. She lunged her free arm out, fingers scrabbling. She connected not with the flashlight, but with the leg of the small, broken, down cabinet that housed the RV's ancient cassette player. The cabinet had been bolted to the wall, but its wood was soft with age and dampness. She didn't pull. Instead, she pushed off it, forcing her body to rotate 90 degrees. The cable resisted, tearing at the flesh of her wrist, but the rotation pulled her away from the center of the hole, allowing her body to flop onto the thin mattress of the bed. The cable, designed to pull straight down, briefly lost its leverage. Her hand immediately grasped the only solid object nearby, the headboard. It was cheap, 2-inch plywood, but it was enough. She locked her arm around it now. Instead of dragging her downward, the cable was pulling her wrist laterally, grinding the bone against the headboard's rough edge. The searing cold of the cable was being replaced by the sickening warmth of her own blood, beginning to seep through the slimy blackness wrapped around her. She needed a weapon, something sharp. Her eyes darted around the tiny space. Nothing, only the smooth, dusty walls. But wait, when she had wrestled the driver's door open moments ago, she had dropped the heavy, cast iron crank handle used for the stabilizer jacks. She left it lying on the vinyl floor, forgotten in her scramble to lock herself inside. It was in the front, near the galley, too far to reach. But as the cable continued its unrelenting pressure, she was pulled further across the mattress. Her right shoulder, locked around the headboard, screamed in protest. But her focus was pure and cold. The galley, she kicked out wildly with her feet, searching for anything solid to brace against. Her heel struck the cabinet she had pushed off. With another desperate, guttural grunt, she twisted her body, using the cabinet as resistance to leverage herself free of the headboard. The cable, sensing the movement, went slack for a microsecond before yanking again. But the shift gave Alara the momentum she needed. She rolled off the mattress, hitting the floor with a painful thud, and began crawling, scrambling toward the center of the RV. The cable became an anchor, dragging her backward. But she used the resistance to her advantage, pulling herself with her free hand along the countertop. The scraping sound was now the noise of her own body being flayed against the linoleum. Scrape, scrape, heave. She reached the galley counter, her fingers slick with grime. She grabbed the edge, hoisting herself onto her knees, ignoring the agonizing pull. On her wrist, the can of soup that had been rolling earlier was still there, now resting perfectly still beneath the counter. She looked down at the floor, panting. The black cable, thick as a garden hose, trailed across the cabin floor, a gleaming, oily trail from the hole in the bed nook to her wrist. If she could break the cable, she had to damage the source. She needed to get to the front of the RV. The crank handle, bracing her knees on the floor, she yanked forward, tearing her wrist from the counter. Grip. She gained a foot of distance, but the pain was blinding. The entity below must have sensed her intention. The cable contracted violently, reeling her in with astonishing speed. She was airborne for a horrifying instant, sliding across the floor. Not the hole. As she flew past the galley, her free hand swung out and grabbed the knife block attached to the wall with Velcro. It was an antique wooden block with 6 slots. She could spare the energy to unvelcro the whole thing. Instead, she simply hooked her fingers over the handle of the largest knife, a massive serrated bread knife, and yanked. The Velcro ripped free, but the knife block held. The force of her pull, however, was enough to dislodge the bread knife, which slid out of its slot. It clattered to the floor, skittering several feet, but it was in front of her. The momentum of the cable dragged her across the last few feet of the galley. Her head slammed against the base of the driver's seat. She saw stars for a split second, and the world dissolved into the high-pitched ringing of an alarm bell in her ears. She landed, gasping, right beside the crank handle she'd been aiming for, and inches from the bread knife. The cable was pulling taut, relentless, ready to drag her back. She didn't hesitate, ignoring the throbbing, wet mass of the cable attached to her left wrist. She seized the cold, heavy crank handle with her right hand. The crank handle was a formidable piece of iron, heavy, sharp, edged, and familiar. She slammed the handle down, not on the cable, but on the floor directly beneath the seat, anchoring herself. The cable tightened one last time, pulling her left arm into a gruesome, unnatural extension. She screamed this time, a raw primal sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the ocean outside. She saw the bread knife. It was serrated, designed to tear. She pressed the handle, weight into the floor, and leaned her entire body back. Then, with her free hand, she snatched the bread knife, reversed the grip, and brought the serrated edge down in a wild, hacking motion against the taut, black cable. It felt like striking rubber encased in cold stone. The serration snagged, but the cable did not yield. The substance felt impossibly dense. She lifted the knife again, brought it down, and saw a glimmer of red in the black ooze. She had cut through the sludge, but not the core. The entity below retaliated. The cable twisted violently around her wrist, digging deeper, sending white, hot agony shooting up her arm and into her shoulder. It doesn't. Do you want the knife? She did. Try to cut the cable again. Instead, she brought the knife in low, aiming for the section of the cable closest to the floor, where it emerged from the black pool. She saw the bread knife pass through the black sludge and hit something soft beneath it. A layer of organic tissue that gave way with a sickening, tearing schlurf. She yanked the knife, twisting. The cable snapped, not cleanly, but with a sudden, violent whipping motion. It retracted instantly, pulling the severed end, still glistening with Alara's blood and the black sludge. Back toward the bed nook with incredible speed, Alara lay panting, the crank handle still clutched in her right hand, the bread knife skittering across the floor. The relief was intoxicating, a brief, dangerous high, but it was immediately replaced by the sickening truth. The end of the cable still wrapped around her wrist remained. It didn't fall off. It simply went inert, becoming a dead, cold bracelet of black rubber fused to her skin. She shoved herself into a sitting position, bracing her back against the dashboard. She looked down at her left wrist. It was a mess, slick, bleeding, and encircled by the terrifying remainder of the thing that had tried to drag her to her death. She crawled back toward the galley, retrieving the flashlight. She shone the weak beam toward the back of the RV. The bed nook was still dark, but the silence had changed. The aggressive heaving from below was gone. It had been replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing, and the hole. The perfectly circular hole was no longer static. Its smooth edges were vibrating, and as Alara watched, frozen in place, a new crack, fine as a strand of hair, spider, webbed out from the hole, perimeter, creeping across the floor toward the galley. The crack was instantly saturated by the viscous, black ooze, spreading the vile, salty stench further through her tiny sanctuary. The RV was not simply parked near the edge of a cliff. It was perched directly above something that was now actively trying to disassemble its vessel and pull her, piece by piece, into the darkness of the coast below. The entire structure was beginning to feel less like a vehicle and more like a poorly constructed raft. And the tide was rising from within. She had to get out, but the main door was sealed, and the driver's door was too heavy, too loud, too close to the terrifying, windswept drop. She was trapped in a box of metal and wood that was being devoured from the inside out. And then, a new sound, closer this time, and completely impossible. It was a soft, wet thump from the narrow cabinet beneath the driver's seat, the one that housed the meager supply of tools and spare fuses. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the ocean. It was a deliberate movement, and it was coming from the darkness beneath her feet. The wet thump was unnervingly close, a sound that spoke of malicious proximity and fresh determination. It came from the small, hinged panel beneath the driver's bench, a shallow compartment meant to store flares, a first aid kit, and various rusted tools. Alara's breathing hitched, sharp and shallow, against the lingering stench of salt and copper. She still clutched the crank handle, its iron weight a cold comfort in her right hand. The bread knife, forgotten in her scramble, was a few feet away, lying uselessly on the floor. Her left wrist, where the severed end of the black cable was now fused like a bizarre, inert manacle, was numb, throbbing with a dull ache that was somehow less terrifying than the immediate, searing pain had been. She looked down. The cabinet door, a sheet of thin, stained plywood, was beginning to vibrate, not rattling from the wind, but a focused internal tremor. The metal clasp holding it shut began to click rhythmically, struggling against an unseen force pushing from within. It found a new way in. The entity that lived beneath the bluff, the one that used black cables to haul its prey into a hole dissolved from the sea, was now attempting a claustrophobic flank attack. Ilara did, too, wait. Time was no longer measured in minutes, but in the widening spiderweb of cracks spreading across the linoleum from the bed nook. That liquid blackness was creeping, devouring the wood, and soon the floor would be a sieve. She raised the crank handle, holding it like a blunt club. She needed to know what she was fighting, but she couldn't allow it to gain purchase on her body again. Moving with a speed born of pure desperation, she slammed the heavy iron handle down onto the vibrating cabinet door, right over the struggling latch. Clang! The sharp noise temporarily muffled the wind. The vibration stopped instantly. Ilara held the handle in place, pressing down with all her weight. A sound returned from within the cabinet, but it wasn't a thump or a scrape. It was a high, pitched, wet hiss, like air escaping a punctured lung. The sound intensified, and then a thin stream of steam or mist began to issue from the space where the door met the cabinet frame. The mist smelled strongly of chlorine and decay. Alara knew she couldn't hold it forever. She had to either secure the door permanently or open it and destroy whatever was inside. She opted for the latter, bracing her feet on the floor. She yanked the crank handle away, then grabbed the cabinet latch and wrenched it open. The door swung outward, revealing a black, square void. The air that rushed out was freezing, colder than the wind outside, and carried the concentrated smell of the abyss. Alara shone the flashlight into the opening, squinting against the glare. The compartment was empty of its usual contents. The flares and tools were gone, possibly dissolved or pulled away. The floor and walls of the compartment were slick with the familiar black ooze, glistening like an insect's carapace, and resting on the slick floor of the box, vibrating faintly, was a collection of stones. Not just one, there were perhaps 6 or 7 of them, all the same smooth, black basalt as the one she had picked up outside and the one that had been shot from the hole. They were clustered together, tightly packed, pulsating with a collective, sickly warmth that was fighting the compartment's internal cold. But the noise wasn't tea coming from the stones. As she watched, hypnotized by the bizarre cluster, one of the stones, the largest one, jerked violently, and attached to its underside, hidden from the light, was a small, glistening black worm. It was no thicker than her pinky finger, but its color was the same absolute light, devouring black as the attacking cable. It was pulling itself along the stone, surface with minute, hooked bristles, leaving a trail of the same caustic black slime in its wake. This thing was not just an inhabitant of the ooze. It was the ooze's mobile delivery system. The thump had been the worm, bearing stone hitting the cabinet door. The worm seemed to sense the light. It raised its tiny, pinprick head, which bore no features but a wet, oily sheen, and began to rapidly pull itself toward the lip of the cabinet. This was the source of the infestation. These were the keys, or perhaps the pilots, for the larger entity below. Alara didn't think. She brought the crank handle down on the cluster of stones with all the frantic force she could muster. Smash. The stones shattered instantly, cracking with a dry mineral sound. But the worm was too fast. It had already escaped the impact zone. The black worm whipped out of the compartment and onto the vinyl floor of the RV. It moved with unnatural speed, not slithering, but twitching and contracting with frightening agility. It made a beeline, not for her, but for the dark patch of spreading ooze in the galley. Alara tracked it with the flashlight. She slammed the crank handle down again, missing the worm by an inch. The impact cracked the linoleum, creating yet another fracture point for the black liquid to exploit. She realized trying to smash it was useless. It was too small, too fast, and she was only damaging her containment vessel further. She grabbed the one object that was always ready, the bread knife. She snatched it up and threw it like a desperate javelin. The knife spun, its serrated edge catching the light. It missed the worm entirely, embedding itself point first into the wall paneling, just above the galley counter with a solid thwunk. But the motion of the throw saved her. The blast of wind that had been battering the RV for hours suddenly intensified. A shock wave of sound and pressure that felt like the mountain itself sighing. The entire RV lurched, not side to side, but forward. Alara felt the sickening slide. The tires previously braced on the gravel had lost traction on the loose shale, and the black, oily slick spreading beneath the RV's foundation. The drift slid a terrifying foot and a half toward the cliff edge. The driver's side, where she was now inches, not feet, from the drop. The grinding noise of the chassis scraping across the rock was deafening. The sound of metal protesting its violent, inevitable end. She stumbled, crashing into the dashboard. She looked out the cracked windshield. The world was spinning. The pewter, gray sky, the churning slate ocean, now filling her view with dizzying immediacy. If it slid again, she was dead. The black worm, startled by the lurch, had frozen in the center of the galley floor, directly in a pool of light. Alara focused on the immediate, external danger, escape. The vehicle was actively failing. The sealed main door on the passenger side was the furthest from the edge. She scrambled toward it, grabbing the crank handle on the way. She braced herself against the wall, reaching for the heavy exterior handle. She tried twisting it, pulling, kicking the door. It was immovable. Whatever had locked it was not a simple bolt, but something that had seized the mechanism in a permanent, mechanical death grip. She looked at her other option, the driver's door. It was mere inches from the cliff, but it was the one she had successfully opened just moments ago. Ignoring the pain in her wrist, ignoring the pulsing hole in the bed nook, and the small black worm now twitching its way back to the cabinet, she lunged for the driver's seat. She gripped the handle, yanked it with brutal force, and felt the rusted mechanism begin to give. But just as the door cracked open enough to let in a blast of frigid, howling air, she heard a sickening react. The driver's door, weakened by years of rust and her violent entry, didn't open cleanly. The hinge closest to the roof tore free from the frame with a shriek of tortured metal. The door was now unsecured at the top, held only by the bottom hinge. It swung out into the wind, catching the massive gust like a sail, and the wind, finding purchase on the newly created wing, applied the final, fatal pressure. The RV groaned, a massive structural sound that shook her to her core. The shift in weight was immediate and final. The drift began to slide again, accelerating this time, not just a foot, but a grinding, violent lurch that threw Alara off her feet. She slammed onto the floor as the RV plunged forward, the tires screaming against the shale, then sliding over nothing at all. The front end of the RV had gone over the edge. She was airborne for a fleeting, horrifying moment before the back tires caught on the lip of the rock, holding the entire metal box suspended over the void. The cab, including her, was pointed down at a terrifying 45-degree angle. Alara was thrown against the dashboard, then slammed back down, her world a dizzying slope of torn metal and howling chaos. She scrambled, grabbing the emergency brake lever. She was hanging in the darkness, suspended above the churning black ocean, and from the hole in the bed nook, the wet, rhythmic pulsing intensified, a deep, triumphant beat reverberating through the structure that was now a perfect, downward facing trap. She looked up the steep incline of the floor, toward the back of the RV, the black worm, the basalt stones, the oozing hole. They were all tumbling forward, sliding down the length of the RV floor toward her, accelerating rapidly. The enemy was literally closing in on her, dragged by the pull of gravity and the terrifying tilt of the vehicle. Ilara is in an impossible situation now, hanging over the cliff with the structural integrity of the RV compromised and the internal threats converging on her. Where should we go next? Should she attempt a desperate escape through the partially ripped driver's door? Or should she use the RV's new angle to her advantage against the sliding black menace? The RV was a seesaw balanced on the sharp edge of disaster. It hung nose down at a 45-degree angle, the front end suspended over 100 feet of churning air and black ocean. The back tires wedged against the lip of the cliff provided the only terrifying anchor. Ilara was pressed against the dashboard, fighting the urge to vomit. Her internal compass had shattered. The floor was now a dizzying slope, and what was once the ceiling felt impossibly far away. Every sound, the structural groaning of stressed metal, the violent howl of the wind rushing through the torn driver's side, was magnified tenfold. She was still clutching the crank handle. Her left wrist, ringed by the cold, inert black manacle, felt alien and useless. She looked up the incline. Everything unsecured was sliding toward her. The cushions, the empty coffee cups, and the worst of it, the spreading pool of black, viscous ooze. The ooze, previously fighting gravity as it seeped from the bed nook, was now gathering speed. And riding the crest of that expanding, oily slick were the remaining dangers. The small, twitching black worm was a dark speck surfing the liquid wave, and right behind it was the gaping, perfectly circular hole in the floor, now the highest point in the RV's body, actively seeping its contents downhill. The entire RV has become a funnel, and she is the drain. She had no time to consider the 60,000-word novel she was trapped inside. She had to survive the next 10 seconds. The black ooze hit the galley counter with a heavy slop, its rank, metallic odor filling the air. Ilara pushed off the dashboard. She needed to reach the driver's door, which was hanging open like a broken jaw, inches from the void. The irony was suffocating. She needed to climb down the floor to escape. She began to crawl, digging the heels of her boots into the seams of the linoleum, using the crank handle as a mountaineer's pick. The slope was steep, slicked by the condensation and the spreading ooze. She reached the driver's seat. The seat belt, dangling uselessly, offered a temporary handhold. She grabbed the taut nylon strap, pulling herself onto the precarious bench. From this new height, she had a terrifying view of the front end. The hood was gone from her sight, swallowed by the drop. The driver's door, still attached by its single, strained bottom hinge, was flapping violently in the wind. The black wave of ooze had breached the galley and was rushing down the central aisle. The black worm was now a foot away from her position, struggling for purchase on the steep incline of the seat bench. Ilara focused on the door. She had to secure herself to something solid before trying to escape, or the wind would simply rip her out. She leaned out, grabbing the rim of the door frame, feeling the metal slice into her fingers. She was terrified of the single, shrieking hinge failing. Suddenly, the black worm managed to gain purchase on the vinyl seat. It shot up the fabric, moving with impossible insectoid speed, aiming directly for her throat. Instinct took over. Alara didn't flinch. Instead, she brought the crank handle around in a savage, sweeping arc crack. She didn't hit the worm. The iron struck the windshield directly above her, which was already stressed and cracked from years of neglect. The windshield shattered, imploding inward with a deafening explosion of tempered glass. The change in pressure was immediate. The vacuum created by the sudden breach of glass sucked the air, the dust, and the black worm out of the RV with a hungry gasp. The worm was gone, whisked into the screaming wind. But the broken windshield also provided a new terrifying avenue for the external chaos. The wind now roared through the cab, a relentless physical force that tried to tear the clothes from her back. The black ooze, however, was still there, sliding rapidly downhill. She looked down at the dashboard. The compartment beneath the driver seat where the stones had been was now weeping liquid. She couldn't stay here. The RV was a single, massive piece of shrapnel waiting to detach from the cliff. She turned her attention back to the hanging door. It was her only exit. The wind was trying to tear the door off its single hinge. Alara had to use that energy, not fight it. She pushed against the dashboard with her feet, fighting the downward tilt. She reached out and wrapped her good right hand around the interior door handle, then twisted it. She pulled the door toward her, fighting the wind, southward pressure. She shoved the crank handle into the gap between the door and the frame, wedging it open, stabilizing it long enough to climb out. She took one last desperate look behind her. Up the incline, the black ooze was cascading down the aisle. The circular hole in the bed nook, now fully revealed, looked less like a cavity and more like a massive, open eye staring down at her. And from the absolute blackness within the hole, she saw movement. It wasn't the slick cable this time. It was a faint, luminous green light pulsing from the bottom of the pit. It was a cold, sickly light, like the luminescence of deep sea decay. Whatever is down there is not just a cable. It has a consciousness, and it knows exactly where she is. The oozing liquid began to foam where it met the base of the driver, by a seat, dissolving the thin vinyl fabric with a soft, acidic sizzle. Alara threw her right leg out the door into the howling emptiness. Her foot found nothing but air. She was relying entirely on the rusted bottom hinge and the wedged crank handle. She twisted her body, using the door frame for leverage, and shoved herself out of the cab. She wasn't on the ground. She was hanging onto the door by the strength of one hand, suspended outside the RV, her body swinging terrifyingly over the sheer drop. The wind grabbed her like an angry, invisible hand, trying to peel her fingers off the frame. Her good hand began to slip. She couldn't hold on. Desperately, she reached with her left hand, the one encased in the dead, cold, black manacle of the cable. She grabbed the edge of the driver seat. The touch was immediate and catastrophic. The moment the severed, inert end of the cable touched the metal of the RV, a searing, white, hot electrical arc erupted. It wasn't electricity, but a violent chemical discharge. The metal of the seat frame instantly sizzled and smoked beneath the contact point. The shock, more energetic than painful, ripped through the cable, manacle, up her arm, and into her chest. But the contact had a different, immediate consequence. It acted as an anchor. The cable, though inert, was now bonded to the RV. She had secured herself, but the brief, violent discharge had done something else. The RV, already strained to its breaking point, gave a final, tearing shriek. The remaining tire, the last anchor, slipped. The drift began its final descent, sliding off the cliff edge with a terrible, grinding inevitability. Alara felt the vehicle drop, pitching forward and down. She was still holding the door frame, the cable, manacle fused to the interior. She was going with it. She had to unanchor. She reached for the crank handle, still wedged in the door frame. She yanked it out, and the door immediately swung wide, tearing its last connection to the body of the RV. The door fell away, spinning wildly into the blackness. Alara was free of the door, but she was still hanging onto the interior by the seat frame. Her left wrist bonded to the RV by the fused cable. The RV plummeted 2 terrifying feet before catching again, but this time it was held not by the tires, but by a massive, unseen root or rock shelf further down the face of the cliff. It came to a sudden, wrenching halt. The angle was now even steeper, closer to 60 degrees. Alara dangled precariously, and as the RV hung there, rocking gently, a second, internal noise began. From the hole in the bed nook, the green light intensified, and the heaving sound returned, louder, deeper, and full of triumph. The thing below knew its trap was successful. She looked up, clinging desperately to the seat frame, her eyes level with the black hole in the floor. The pool of ooze was still cascading downward, but now she could see what was rising to meet her in the hole. It was a dense, fibrous mass, black as midnight, surrounded by the sickly green glow. It wasn't a cable. It wasn't a worm. It was a knot, a mass of interwoven, crystalline tendrils, shimmering with the brine, and it was expanding, stretching toward the dangling woman. Alara realized she wasn't just dangling. She was the lure. The black cable on her wrist was heating up, conducting the immense energy of the entity below. She had to cut it, and she had to cut it now. She reached inside her pocket, searching for the small folding utility knife she carried. It wasn't there. She left it on the dash, but she had the crank handle. It was not sharp, but it was heavy iron. The fibrous mass was emerging from the hole, its crystalline tendrils reaching. She brought the crank handle down on the inert cable around her wrist, hitting it against the sharp metal edge of the seat frame in a brutal, repeated attack. Smash, crunch, she cried out as the impact vibrated through her arm, tearing the skin. But the cold metal of the cable remained fused. She needed to use the green light, that unnatural glow. She aimed the crank handle for the fibrous mass emerging from the hole, slamming it with primal force. Thwack. The impact was shocking. Instead of striking something soft, the iron handle met resistance like solid, ancient ceramic. The fibrous mass recoiled slightly, but the handle bounced back, ringing with a high-pitched, metallic whine. She looked at the crank handle. The iron was marked. A thin smear of the luminous green substance was smoking faintly on the crank handle. S-tip, and the entire RV shuddered. Not from the wind, but from a calculated, deliberate pull from below. A massive displacement that signaled the entity was tired of playing. Alara was now sliding, her grip failing, moving back toward the dashboard, toward the broken windshield, toward the final drop. The cable on her wrist was vibrating violently, ready to tear her limb from her body. She had one last option, the broken windshield. With a superhuman effort, she kicked backward, aiming for the shattered gap in the windshield, and threw the iron crank handle out into the wind, letting the sheer force of the cliff, S-draft, take it. The handle disappeared instantly. She followed it. She let go of the seat frame and plunged headfirst through the gap, trusting that the wind would carry her past the jagged edges of the broken glass. She tumbled out of the RV and into the howling void, but the black cable on her wrist had done its job. As she fell, the inert manacle snagged on the jagged metal edge of the broken windshield frame. She didn't fall. She was left dangling, suspended by the fragile strength of her wrist and the cold, metallic grip of the creature. Severed limb, a mere foot below the underside of the RV, which was itself clinging precariously to the cliff face. The RV, having lost the weight of her body, gave a small, protesting bounce. Alara hung, her feet finding no purchase, looking down into the absolute, limitless blackness. She could feel the enormous weight of the RV pressing down on her, and hear the triumphant, bubbling heave of the entity waiting below. She was now outside the trap, but still chained to it. Alara has survived the RV, but she is still tethered to the abyss. The key to her survival will be to sever that final link. What element of her surroundings or gear should she use next to break free? We need something high, stakes and permanent. Alara's world was reduced to 3 brutal, immediate sensations: the cold, crushing weight of the black cable, manacle around her left wrist, the agonizing, grinding friction where the manacle was snagged on the jagged steel of the RV's broken windshield frame, and the dizzying, nauseating terror of the 100-foot drop below. She hung in the abyss, a living pendulum suspended beneath the belly of the drift. The RV itself was her executioner, suspended at a deadly angle, occasionally shifting with the wind, sending jarring tremors through her arm. She could hear the thing below, the source of the black ooze and the slick cables. It was celebrating. The rhythmic heaving from the cliff face had morphed into a deep, guttural slurping sound, a noise of preparation. It was trying to re-establish its pull, subtly shifting the balance of the RV, trying to shake its lure free and claim her entirely. The cable around her wrist was now scalding hot, the searing pain a violent counterpoint to the freezing wind. It was drawing energy from the mass below, trying to burn its way free of the glass and steel snag. Alara had to act. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, the shattered RV above her, and the terrifying knowledge that the cable was melting its anchor point. She looked up, twisting her head until her neck cracked. She could see the underside of the RV's chassis, rusted, coated in road grime, and streaked with the caustic black ooze that was dissolving the world. Above her, the jagged steel edge of the windshield frame, where the glass had shattered, held the cable in a death grip. Friction, that was the only way. The cable was impossibly tough, but she knew the steel edge had to be sharper. She had to use the kinetic energy of the dangling RV to her advantage. Taking a deep, painful breath, she began to swing. It was a small, miserable effort at first. She kicked her feet, propelling her body sideways, then pulling back. The cable, manacle groaned against the steel frame. Swing, thud. Swing, thud. She was trying to turn the razor, sharp steel of the RV into a crude wire, cutter using her own body as the force generator. Each sickening thud sent a jolt of pain through her wrist that felt like bone splitting. As she swung back and forth, she began to scrape the manacle against the steel frame with greater force. The cable material, which had resisted the bread knife, was finally yielding. A thin, acrid smoke, smelling of ozone and burning rubber, curled away from the point of contact. She was making progress. A hairline split, a pale gray line, appeared in the black manacle material. But the entity below was fighting back. From the dark face of the cliff, a new sound emerged, a high-pitched, grinding squeal. The massive root or rock shelf that was supporting the back end of the RV was beginning to crumble. The RV dropped another 6 inches with a terrifying gut, lurching plunge. The sudden jolt ripped Ilara, his arm across the steel edge. The black manacle was nearly severed, but the momentum was so violent it nearly tore her entire arm from its socket. She screamed, the sound lost in the wind. The RV settled precariously again. The cable was barely holding. Only a few fused, thick fibers remained connected. And now, she realized the second terrifying consequence of the drop. The RV was so close to the cliff face that her dangling body was swinging directly back into the sheer wall of rock. The wind slammed her backward. Her shoulder struck the cold, wet shale of the cliff with a painful impact, jarring her teeth. She looked up. A thin, crystalline ooze was weeping from the rock face itself, several feet above her head. The cliff wasn't just a physical barrier. It was the skin of the entity. She was trapped between the falling RV and the oozing rock. She had to break the cable now. She swung her legs, planting her feet on the cliff face. The rock was slick with brine, but she found a tiny, sharp protrusion of granite. She pushed off the rock with all her remaining strength, driving her body forward and upward, aiming to snap the remaining fibers of the cable on the steel frame. Snap, the final, high. Tensile fibers gave way with a sound like a pistol shot. Ilara was instantly free of the RV, the severed cable, manacle still gripping the windshield frame. But momentum was a cruel mistress. Having just pushed off the cliff, she was propelled forward, spinning away from the rock face. For one dizzying moment, she was utterly free, falling through the air. She scrabbled wildly, her right hand catching the very edge of the RV's rear bumper, which was still wedged against the cliff lip. Her grip was precarious. Her body swung inward, slamming her against the undercarriage of the RV. She clung there, dizzy, bruised, but alive, suspended between the plunging vehicle and the vast, swirling ocean. She managed to pull herself up onto the narrow lip of the bumper, her stomach churning at the sight of the drop. She was now perched on the RV, single, last anchor point, the only piece of metal still touching solid rock. She looked up the remaining incline of the cliff. The dark, wet, oozing shale face stretched above her. She needed to climb, but as she placed her right hand on the slick rock to find purchase, she saw it, the crank handle. The heavy iron tool she had thrown out of the cab had, by some impossible twist of fate, lodged itself in a shallow crack in the rock face just 2 feet above her. It was a perfect accidental climbing aid. She reached for it, her fingers slick with effort and terror. She pulled, and the iron held. She used the crank handle to hoist herself upward, finding purchase on the slick, brine-soaked shale. She climbed 2 feet, then 3. The RV's rear bumper was now beneath her feet. She looked back down at the RV. The severed cable manacle, still hot and smoking, had completely melted through the glass, and steel frame and was retracting rapidly into the cab. The RV was now a dead husk, and the massive rhythmic slurp below had intensified. The entity was pulling the RV's metal mass into the dark. The drift gave one final violent lurch, this time forward and down, completely detaching from the cliff face. It plunged into the blackness with a deafening, metallic shriek of tearing metal, vanishing instantly into the churning water and foam below. The entire cliff shuddered with the impact. Ilara was thrown against the rock face, clinging desperately to the crank handle. When she could look down again, there was nothing but foam and spray. The RV was gone. She was alone on the cliff face, the wind a relentless, physical assault, the stench of brine and chlorine overwhelming. She climbed another 10 feet, Finally reaching the gravel and scrub grass of the plateau, she collapsed, breathless, shivering uncontrollably. It was then she realized the cable wasn't entirely gone. The end still attached to her wrist hadn't fallen off during the struggle. Now that the primary connection was severed, the cable manacle had gone cold, and it had begun to shrink. It was tightening around her wrist, shrinking into a hard, black, rubbery band, a permanent, hideous bracelet of the enemy, embedding itself deep into her flesh. She tried to tear it off, scrape it with her fingernails, but it was solid, cold, and fused to her skin. It felt like a deep sea tracking device, marking her, identifying her. The horror was no longer an external threat. It was an internal certainty. She was still connected to the abyss. She stood, unsteady, and looked out over the cliff edge where the drift had been. The sea was raging, black and endless. And then she saw a light. Not the sickly green light of the abyss, but a strong, deliberate beam cutting through the gloom. It was approaching from the west, coming down the long, winding access road. A vehicle. A normal vehicle. Relief hit her like a physical wave, threatening to collapse her entirely. Salvation, a way out of this impossible, living nightmare. She began to run toward the road, stumbling over the gravel. But as the light approached, she noticed two things. The light wasn't coming from a car, but from a pair of headlamps mounted too high to be street legal. It looked like some kind of massive truck or specialized utility vehicle. The vehicle wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating, tearing down the road at breakneck speed, its massive tires spitting rock and shale. And then she saw the symbol painted crudely on the side of the cab, illuminated briefly by its own lights, a white, downward, pointing triangle bisected by a wavy line. A symbol she had never seen before, yet one that chilled her to the core. It wasn't salvation. It was coming for her. Alara has survived the RV and is now facing a new external threat that seems to be tracking her. Would you like the next chapter to focus on Alara's attempt to evade this oncoming vehicle, or should we reveal who or what is driving it?